Chapter 2 Kindly Friends. She didn't say nothing about the calf, Lyddie said, suddenly in the midst of their sorrowful packing up. She got no cause to, Charles said. We never tell her about it. You know, Charlie, that calf is rightfully ours. He looked at her, his honest head cocked, his eyes dubious. No, truly. We was the ones Quaker Stevens. We was the ones asked Quaker Stevens to lend us use of his bull. Mama didn't have nothing to do with it. But if they's debts, she's letting out the fields and the horse and cow. She's sending you to be a miller's boy and me to housemaid. She got us body and soul. We got no call to give her the calf. She set one hand on her waist and straightened her aching back. What do you aim to do with it? Hush, I'm studying on it. Obediently, he quieted and stared in the same direction at the spindly maples that made up their stand of sugar bush. It's a nice fat heifer, she said. We kept it so long on its mother's milk. We'll get a good price for it. We'd be bound to give the money to her. No! Her voice was sharper than she meant, ground as it was on 3 years of unspoken anger. We always done that, and look where it's got us. No, she said again, this time softly. The money don't go there. She'll give it away to Uncle Judah, who'll give it to that preacher who says you don't need nothing 'cause the world is going to end. She turned to her brother. Charlie, you and me can't think about that. We got to think about keeping this farm for when Papa comes back. We should take that money and bury it someplace, so when we get free we can come back here and have a little seed cash to start over with. Maybe she'll sell the farm. She can't, not so long as Papa's alive. But maybe... We don't know that, do we? We gotta believe he's coming back, or he's sending for us. I hope he don't send for us. We'll persuade him to stay, she said. She wanted for a minute to put her arm around his thin shoulders, but she held back. She didn't want him to think that she considered him less than the man he had so bravely sought to be. We're a good team, eh, Charlie? Ox or mule? He asked, grinning. A little of both, I reckon. They cleaned the cabin and swept out the splintery plank floor. They knew it was a rough and homely place compared to the farmhouses along the road and the ample mansions around the village green. But their father, the seventh son of a poor Connecticut Valley farmer, had bought the land and built the cabin with his own hands before their birth, promising every year to sell enough sugar maple, or oats, or pot ash to build a larger, proper house with a real barn attached, instead of a shed which must be found through rain or blizzard. His sugar bush was scraggly, and his oat crop barely enough to feed his growing family. There were stumps to burn aplenty as he cleared the land, but suddenly there was no need for potash in England, and hardly any demand in Vermont. He borrowed heavily to buy himself 3 sheep, and the bottom dropped out of the wool market the very year he had had enough wool to think of it as a cash crop. He was an unlucky man. Even his children sensed that. But he loved them and worked hard for them, and they loved him fiercely in return. Pulling shut the door, which despite all Charles's efforts still did not close quite flush, they remembered the bear and wondered how they could keep the wild creatures from destroying the cabin in their absence. Finally, Charles suggested that they take all the wood left in the woodpile and stack it in front of the door. It took them close to an hour to accomplish the move, but sweating and breathing hard, they admired their fortress effect. That made it a little easier for them to go. Charlie rode bareback astride the plow horse, his brown heels dug into the horse's wide flanks. Lyddie, leading the cow, followed close by. She carried a gunny sack, which held her other dress and night shift. Her outgrown boots were joined by the laces and slung over her shoulder. The long walk would be more easily done with her feet free and bare. There was no need to tie the calf. It danced around its mother's backside, bleeding constantly for her to stand still long enough for a meal. It was the end of May. The mud was drying in the deeply rutted roadway, but Lyddie did not watch her feet. Birds were playing in and out of the tall trees on either side of the road, calling and singing in the pale lacy greens and rusts of the new growth, and the deep green of the pines and firs. Here and there wildflowers dared to dance in full summer dress, forgetting that any night might bring a killing frost. Lyddie breathed in the sweet air. "It's spring," she said. Charles nodded. "Do you mind too much going to the mill?" she asked. He shrugged. "I don't rightly know. Don't seem too bad. Dusty, I reckon. And not much time to be lazy, eh?" She laughed. "You wouldn't know how to be lazy, Charlie." He smiled at the compliment. "I'd rather be home." She sighed. "We'll be back, Charlie. I promise." They were both quiet a moment, remembering their father saying almost the same words. "Truly," she added. "I'm sure of it." He smiled. "Sure," he said. They were in sight now of Quaker Stevens's farm. They could see him, his broad-brimmed, straight black hat surrounded by the black hats of his 3 grown sons. They had the oxen yoked to a sled, which was already half loaded with stones, and were digging away at more stones buried in a newly cleared field. Their farmhouse, close to the road, had been added onto over the years. The outlines of the first salt box could be made out on the northern end, which melted on the backside into a larger frame Cape Cod. Then an L that served as shed, storage, privy, and corridor to 2 barns, the larger one growing out of the smaller. They were rich for all their Quaker adherence to the simple life. Envy crept up like a noxious vine. Lyddie snapped it off, but the roots were deep and beyond her reach. Before they called out, the farmer had seen them. He waved, took off his hat to wipe his head and face on the sleeve of his homespun shirt, replaced his hat, and made his way across the field to the road. "I see my bull served thee well," he said, smiling. His face was broad and red, his hair curly and gray about his ears. Great caterpillar eyebrows crowned his kindly eyes. "We come to thank you," Lyddie began, thinking fast, wanting to be fair and honest, but at the same time wanting a larger price for the calf that she knew in her heart was partly his. "Thee brought these beasts 5 miles down the road for that?" he asked, his woolly eyebrows high up on his forehead. Lyddie blushed. "The truth is, we're taking the horse and cow to Mr. Westcott in payment of debt, and we're obliged to sell off this pretty calf straight away. Our mothers put us out to work." "These leaving thy land?" "It's let as well," she said, allowing just a tiny hint of sadness to creep into her voice. "Charles here and I was waiting for our father to come back from the West, but—" "Thee's been alone all winter? Just thee 2 children?" She could feel Charles stiffen beside her. "We managed fine," she said. He took off his hat again and wiped his face and neck. "I should have come to call on my neighbors," he said quietly. She sensed a weakness. "You wouldn't be interested—" "No, surely not. You got a mighty herd already." "I'll give thee $20 for the calf," he said quickly. "No, 25. I know the sire, and he's of a good line." He smiled. Lyddie pretended to think. "Seems mighty high," she said. "She's half yours by rights," Charlie blurted out before Lyddie could elbow him quiet. His honesty would be her death yet. But the kind man persisted. "It's a fair price for a nice fat little heifer. These kept her well." He invited them in to complete their business transaction, and before they were done, they found themselves eating a hearty noon dinner with the family. The room they sat down in was larger than the whole cabin, with the shed thrown in. It was kitchen and parlor, with a corner for spinning and weaving. The Quakers were rich enough to own their own loom. The meal spread out on the long oak table looked like a king's feast to children who, until the cow freshened, had lived mostly on rabbit and bark soup, and the last of the moldy potatoes from the year before. The Quaker's wife was as large and red-faced as her husband, and equally kind. She urged them to eat, for they still had a long walk ahead of them. This reminded Quaker Stevens that he needed nails. One of the boys could take them to the mill, and then on to the village, he said. The cow and horse must be tethered to the back of the wagon, so it would be nearly as slow as walking until they got to Westcott's, but if they'd care for the ride. The sons had removed their hats for the meal. They looked much younger and less stern than she remembered them. The youngest, Luke, she had seen more often, back in the days when she had gone to school. He had been one of the enormous boys who sat in the back of the schoolroom, 16 or so when she was a tiny one in the front row. She hadn't gone to school at all since her father left. She hadn't dared to leave the babies alone with their mother. Charles had gone for most of the 4-month term up until this past winter, until it had seemed too hard. She hoped the miller would let him do some schooling. He had a good mind, not so stubborn against learning as hers seemed to be. Luke Stevens tied the horse and cow to the back of the wagon, and then came around to give Lyddie a hand up, but she pretended not to see. She couldn't have the man thinking she was a child or a helpless female. She jumped up the high step into the wagon, and then realized she'd been squeezed between Luke and Charles on the narrow seat. She sat as tightly into herself as she could. She wasn't used to brushing bodies with near strangers. They hardly touched one another in the family. It made her feel small and tongue-tied to be so close to this great hulk of a man. He wasn't much of a talker either. He leaned forward from time to time and talked around her to Charles. He asked if Charlie knew much about the mill where he'd be working. Charles's sweet, high-pitched, boyish tones made him seem heartbreakingly young against the deep male voice of his questioner. It was so unfair. This man had both father and mother and older brothers to live with and to care for him, while little Charlie must make his way in the world alone. She felt around the bottom of the gunny sack until her fingers found the lump of coinage. She pinched the money hard to remind herself not to cry. Then the farm will just lie fallow? Luke was asking Charles. No, it's let. The fields and pasture and sugar bush for the debt. The house and shed will just leave be. I hope the snow don't do in the roofs. Charles's anxious concern was almost too much for Lyddie to bear. Oh, they'll be all right, and we'll be back in a couple of years. I could stop by. Would thee like me to stop by? Shovel the snow off the roof if need be? No need, she started, but Charles was already thanking him for his kindness. I'd be obliged, he said. It would take the worry off. Lyddie and me aim to keep it standing against Papa's return. Don't make it trouble for yourself, though. It'd be no trouble, Luke said kindly. Ain't nobody to pack down the track come snow. He ignored her grumpy tone, smiling at her. I can snowshoe it. Nothing's better than a good hike on my own. That house gets mighty crowded come winter. The way he spoke made Lyddie feel that she was the child and Charles the responsible one. The horse and cow were safely delivered to Mr. Westcott. His farm lay in the river plain and was already alive with new shoots of corn. Shoots of new corn, excuse me. Lyddie watched Mr. Westcott lead their old cow and horse away. Next to Westcott's sleek stock, they'd look like hungry sparrows pecking in a henyard. At a livelier clip, they took the river road toward Baker's Mill. I can walk from here easy, Charles protested, but Luke shook him off. Faster I get home, sooner I'm hauling rocks, he said, laughing. She didn't want Luke Stevens watching while she bid Charles goodbye. But again, maybe it was better. She might weaken if they were alone. and that would never do. I'll only be in the village, she said. Maybe you can drop up. Charles put his little hand on her arm. You mustn't worry, eh, Lyddie? He said. You'll be all right. She nearly laughed. He was trying to comfort her. Or maybe she nearly cried. She watched the gaping mouth of the mill swallow up his small form. He turned in the immense doorway. It was large enough to drive a high wagon through, and waved. Let's be going, she said. It's late. Luke nodded his head with a dip of his funny black hat. This here is Cutler's Tavern, he said. They hadn't spoken since they left the mill. Shall I come to the door with thee? The wagon had stopped before a low stone wall hung with a rail gate. She was horrified. No, no need, she said. They might not understand me riding up with a... She scrambled to the ground. He grinned. I hope to see thee before too much time is up, he said. Meantime, I'll see to thy house. He leaned over the seat. I'll give a look in on thy Charlie, too, he said. He's a good boy. She didn't know whether to be pleased or annoyed, but he clicked his tongue and the wagon pulled away, leaving her alone in her new life.